Cinderella, reimagined, the heart behind the crown. Chapter 1. The Lonely Prince. Prince Alexander stood before the ornate mirror in his chambers, studying the face that would never grace a coin or inspire a portrait. His reflection showed what it always had: a nose that bent slightly to the left from a childhood fall, thin brown hair that refused to hold any fashionable style, and eyes that were kind but utterly ordinary. At 23, he had long ago accepted that he would never be the handsome prince of storybooks, but acceptance and peace were entirely different matters. "Your Highness," came a gentle voice from the doorway. His mother, Queen Isabella, entered with the quiet grace that had made her beloved throughout the kingdom. Her eyes, so similar to his own, held the same warmth they had since his childhood. "The ladies Cordelia and Beatrice have arrived for tea." Alexander's shoulders sagged slightly. Another afternoon of forced pleasantries with women who could barely conceal their disappointment when they looked at him. "Of course, Mother. I'll be down shortly." The Queen approached and placed a tender hand on his shoulder. "They are lovely girls, Alexander. Perhaps if you gave them a chance to fall in love with the royal treasury?" Alexander turned from the mirror, managing a weak smile for his mother's sake. "I've given them chances, Mother. I've given them all chances." He moved to the window overlooking the palace courtyard, where servants bustled about their daily tasks with purpose and contentment. How he envied them, their simple lives, their ability to form connections based on genuine affection rather than political calculation. "Lady Cordelia mentioned your discussion of poetry yesterday," Queen Isabella said hopefully. "She seemed quite engaged." Alexander nearly laughed. Yes, Lady Cordelia had been engaged in memorizing just enough verse to seem cultured, while her eyes calculated the worth of his ruby signet ring. He had watched her gaze drift to his jewelry, his fine clothes, the golden fixtures of the room, anywhere but his actual face when she thought he wasn't looking. "She was very attentive," he said diplomatically. The truth was more painful than he cared to admit. During their walk through the palace gardens, Lady Cordelia had praised his wisdom and noble bearing, while maintaining the practiced smile of a woman performing a role. When he had quoted his favorite passage from an ancient poem about true love conquering all barriers, she had nodded enthusiastically and immediately changed the subject to the upcoming harvest festival and the traditional royal gifts bestowed upon the court. "Alexander," his mother said softly, "you are a good man with a generous heart. The right woman will see that." He turned back to her, this woman who had never once made him feel lacking, who had raised him to value kindness over conquest and wisdom over wealth. "And what if she doesn't exist, Mother? What if I'm destined to marry someone who can barely tolerate looking at me?" Queen Isabella's eyes filled with the fierce love that had protected him through countless childhood hurts. "Then she would be a fool and unworthy of you. But I believe—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I believe that somewhere in this kingdom is a woman who will love you exactly as you are. You must have faith." After his mother left, Alexander retreated to his private study, a sanctuary lined with books of philosophy, poetry, and tales of adventure. Here, surrounded by the thoughts of great minds throughout history, he felt less alone. He pulled out his leather-bound journal and began to write, as he did most evenings when the weight of his loneliness grew too heavy to bear. "Another day of performances," he wrote. "Lady Cordelia spoke of poetry, but her eyes spoke of gold. Lady Beatrice complimented my intelligence while examining the jewels in my crown. They see Prince Alexander, the title, the inheritance, the political alliance. But who sees simply Alexander? Who might love the man who reads until dawn, who dreams of making the kingdom more just, who would give up every royal privilege for one honest conversation, one genuine smile, meant for him alone?" He set down his quill and stared out at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the palace walls lived thousands of people, farmers and merchants, teachers and craftsmen, mothers and daughters. Among them, surely, was someone who valued kindness over appearance, someone who believed, as he did, that the heart mattered more than the face that housed it. But how would he ever find her when every interaction was filtered through his crown, when every conversation was shadowed by his title and treasury? Alexander closed his journal and prepared for another evening of diplomatic dinners and calculated charm, wondering if he was doomed to spend his life surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Chapter 2. Cinderella's Daily Struggles. "Cinderella, the floors won't scrub themselves." The sharp voice of her stepmother, Lady Tremaine, cut through the morning air like a blade. Cinderella pressed her back against the stone wall of the cottage cellar, allowing herself just one more moment of stillness before facing another day of endless tasks. Her hands, already rough from years of harsh soap and cold water, ached as she gripped the scrub brush. The wooden floors of their modest cottage bore the scars of countless scrubbings, yet somehow Lady Tremaine always found new stains to point out, new imperfections that required Cinderella's immediate attention. "Coming, stepmother," Cinderella called, rising from her brief rest. She had learned long ago that responding quickly and without complaint made the days pass more peacefully. As she climbed the narrow stairs, the worn fabric of her brown dress caught on a splinter, another tear to mend by candlelight when her other work was finished. The main room of the cottage buzzed with activity as her stepsisters, Drizella and Anastasia, prepared for their morning social calls. Gowns of silk and satin lay draped across chairs, while the sisters argued over jewelry and hair ribbons. Their voices, shrill with entitlement, filled the space with discord. "Mother, tell Drizella she cannot wear the pearl necklace again," Anastasia whined, her pretty face twisted with petulance. "It clashes terribly with her complexion." "At least I have a complexion worth adorning," Drizella shot back, snatching the pearls from her sister's grasp. "Unlike some people who cake their faces with so much powder, they look like ghosts." Lady Tremaine surveyed the chaos with the calculating eyes of a woman who had married Cinderella's father purely for his modest wealth, only to discover that maintaining appearances required far more money than he had left behind. "Enough, both of you! Cinderella, clean up this mess and then see to the washing. The Whitmore family is hosting tea this afternoon, and you girls must look presentable." Cinderella nodded and began gathering the discarded clothing, careful not to step on the delicate fabrics. As she worked, she listened to her stepfamily's excited chatter about which eligible bachelors might attend the Whitmore's gathering, which families had gained or lost social standing in recent weeks, who wore what to the last major event in town. Their world revolved entirely around appearances and social climbing, concepts that felt as foreign to Cinderella as speaking a different language. She folded each garment with the same care she would have shown her own clothes if she had owned anything worth such attention. "Make sure you press my blue silk carefully," Anastasia commanded without looking at her, "and use the lavender water. I want to smell like a lady, not a servant." The casual cruelty of the comment stung, but Cinderella had long ago learned to let such barbs bounce off her like rain on stone. She was not a servant by birth, but circumstances had made her one, and dwelling on the injustice would only breed bitterness in her heart. After her stepfamily departed in a flurry of perfume and silk, Cinderella finally found herself alone. The cottage felt lighter without their presence, as if the very walls could breathe more freely. She moved through her tasks with practiced efficiency, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, preparing the evening meal from their meager provisions. But it was when she stepped into the small garden behind the cottage that Cinderella truly came alive. Here, Among the vegetables she had coaxed from stubborn soil and the flowers she had planted in memory of her mother, she felt connected to something larger than her daily struggles. Her mother's grave lay beneath the old apple tree at the garden's heart, marked by a simple stone that Cinderella kept adorned with fresh blooms. She knelt beside it now, as she did every morning, and spoke in the gentle voice she reserved for this sacred time. "Good morning, Mama," she whispered, arranging a small bouquet of wild flowers. "The tomatoes are coming along beautifully. You would be so proud. And Mrs. Henderson's baby is walking now. I helped her repair her fence yesterday, and she insisted on giving me some of her fresh bread." The elderly widow who lived in the cottage next door had become something of a friend, one of the few people who saw Cinderella as more than Lady Tremain's unpaid help. Their quiet conversations over the garden wall brought moments of genuine human connection to her otherwise isolated existence. "I keep thinking about what you used to tell me," Cinderella continued, pulling a few weeds from around the flowers. "That true beauty comes from kindness, and that somewhere in this world is someone who will see my heart before anything else. Some days it's hard to believe, Mama. Some days I wonder if I'll spend my whole life washing other people's clothes and listening to other people's dreams." A gentle breeze stirred the apple tree's leaves, and for a moment Cinderella could almost imagine it was her mother's hand stroking her hair, as she had done so many years ago. The memory brought both comfort and longing, comfort in the knowledge that she had been deeply loved, longing for that kind of acceptance again. As the sun climbed higher, Cinderella heard the clip-clop of horses approaching. Her stepfamily was returning earlier than expected, which meant the afternoon's plans had likely been cancelled or abbreviated. She quickly finished her garden work and hurried inside to begin preparing for whatever new demands awaited. But in the quiet moments between chores, as she kneaded bread dough or stirred soup, Cinderella allowed herself to dream. She imagined conversations with someone who valued her thoughts, not just her ability to serve. She pictured walking hand in hand with a person who found her beautiful, not despite her calloused hands and simple dress, but because of the gentle heart that guided them. These dreams sustained her through the longest days and darkest nights, fragile hopes that flickered like candle flames in her heart. She didn't dare hope for rescue. She had learned to rescue herself through resilience and grace. But she did hope, quietly and persistently, that love might find her even in the most unlikely circumstances. Chapter 3. The Royal Proclamation. King William paced the length of his private study, his heavy footsteps echoing against the stone walls adorned with portraits of ancestors who had never faced quite this particular royal dilemma. Across from him, Queen Isabella sat in thoughtful silence, her embroidery forgotten in her lap, as she watched her husband wrestle with their son's unhappiness. "He grows more withdrawn each day," the king said, pausing at the window that overlooked the palace gardens, where Alexander often walked alone. "Yesterday I found him in the library again, reading poetry instead of attending the war council meeting. When I asked him about it, he said, 'What use is strategy when I cannot even strategize my way to a single genuine conversation?'" Queen Isabella set down her needlework and joined her husband at the window. "The ladies who visit see only the crown, William. They perform for him as if he were an audience rather than a man. How can love grow in such artificial soil?" They had watched their son endure countless formal dinners, where potential brides recited rehearsed compliments and strategic small talk. They had observed him growing quieter after each social gathering, retreating further into his books and his private thoughts. The king and queen, who had fallen in love as childhood friends before either knew of their eventual betrothal, understood the profound loneliness of being loved for everything except who you truly were. "There must be a way," King William murmured. "Somewhere in our kingdom lives a woman who would appreciate Alexander's gentle heart, his sharp mind, his genuine desire to serve his people well. But how can she see these qualities when she's blinded by his title before they even speak. Queen Isabella's eyes brightened with sudden inspiration. What if she couldn't see his title? What if no one could see anyone's true identity? The king turned to his wife, intrigued by the spark of an idea forming in her voice. A masquerade ball, she continued, her words gaining momentum, not just for the nobility, but for every eligible young woman in the kingdom. Rich and poor, noble and common, merchant and farmer's daughter. Everyone masked, everyone disguised, everyone equal for one night. King William's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile he had worn in weeks. Isabella, you brilliant woman. If Alexander were just another masked gentleman at a ball, if his conversation and character were all a lady had to judge him by, then perhaps someone might fall in love with the man instead of the crown, the queen finished. And perhaps Alexander might discover that he is worthy of love exactly as he is. Within the hour, the royal scribes were summoned to draft a proclamation unlike any in the kingdom's history. The language was carefully crafted to emphasize inclusion and mystery while maintaining the dignity expected of royal communications. 3 days later, town criers stood in every village square, their voices carrying across cobblestone streets and dirt roads into farmhouses and manor houses alike. Hear ye! Hear ye! By royal decree of their majesties King William and Queen Isabella, all unmarried ladies of marriageable age are cordially invited to attend a grand masquerade ball at the royal palace on the evening of the full moon. All attendees must wear masks and disguises that completely conceal their identity. No titles shall be announced, no family names revealed. For one night, all ladies shall be equal in the eyes of the court. The finest musicians, the most exquisite refreshments, and dancing until dawn await all who wish to attend. By royal invitation, none shall be turned away who comes in good faith and appropriate disguise. The announcement sent ripples of excitement and speculation throughout the kingdom. In noble houses, seamstresses worked frantically to create elaborate gowns and ornate masks. In merchant families, mothers pooled their resources to ensure their daughters could attend. In farming villages, young women who had never dared dream of entering the palace gates whispered to each other about the possibility of dancing where royalty danced. The rumors flew as quickly as autumn leaves in a windstorm. Some speculated that the prince himself would choose a bride at the ball. Others believed it was merely an elaborate entertainment. A few wise souls suspected that the royal family had deeper motivations, though none could guess the true reason behind the unprecedented invitation. In his chambers, Prince Alexander learned of his parents' plan with a mixture of terror and hope that left his hands trembling as he read the proclamation. For the first time in his adult life, he would attend a social gathering where no one knew he was the prince. No one would approach him seeking favor or fortune. No one would hide their disappointment behind practiced smiles. "You don't have to do anything except be yourself," his mother assured him as they discussed the elaborate costume being prepared for him. "Speak of what interests you. Dance with whomever you choose. Let your heart guide you instead of protocol." "And if no one finds me interesting without my title?" Alexander asked, voicing his deepest fear. King William placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Then at least you'll know the truth. But I suspect, my boy, that you'll discover you have far more to offer than you've ever realized." The palace staff began preparations for an event unlike any in the kingdom's history. The great ballroom was decorated with silver and gold. Thousands of candles were ordered, and the finest chefs in the land were commissioned to prepare a feast worthy of both princesses and peasants. As word of the masquerade spread, excitement built to a fever pitch throughout the kingdom. For some, it represented opportunity and adventure. For others, it offered a chance to step outside the rigid boundaries of social class for a single magical evening. And in a small cottage on the outskirts of the kingdom, a young woman tending her garden heard the news with a wistful smile, never imagining that this royal whim would change her life forever. The seeds of destiny, like the flowers in her garden, sometimes sprouted in the most unexpected soil. The stage was set for an evening where hearts might speak louder than titles, where authentic connection might bloom under the protection of anonymity, and where two lonely souls might finally find in each other the love they had each thought impossible to discover. Chapter 4. The Step-Family's Preparations. The royal proclamation reached Lady Tremain's cottage on a crisp morning when the autumn air was sharp with possibility. The town crier's voice carried clearly across the small village, and by the time his words faded, Lady Tremain was already calculating the opportunities this masquerade ball represented for her daughters. "Girls!" she called sharply, her voice cutting through the morning quiet like a knife through silk. "Come here immediately. We have planning to do." Drizella and Anastasia rushed into the main room, still in their mourning robes, their faces bright with curiosity. When their mother repeated the royal proclamation, both sisters began speaking at once, their voices rising in pitch and volume as excitement overtook them. "A ball at the palace!" Anastasia squealed, clapping her hands together. "Mother, this is our chance. One of us could catch the prince's eye." "The prince will certainly choose his bride that night," Drizella added with certainty that had no basis beyond her own desperate hope. "It's obvious. Why else would the royal family invite every eligible woman in the kingdom?" Lady Tremain's mind was already working through the logistics and expenses. The family's finances had been strained ever since her husband's death, when she discovered that his modest wealth was far more modest than she had been led to believe. But this ball, this was an investment that could secure their future forever. "We must spare no expense," she declared, her eyes gleaming with ambition. "If one of you marries the prince, we'll never want for anything again. Drizella, you'll wear the blue silk we've been saving. Anastasia, the rose-colored taffeta will complement your complexion. And we'll need new masks, new slippers, new jewelry." The sisters exchanged glances of pure joy. They had grown up believing that their beauty and their mother's social climbing would eventually secure them advantageous marriages, but a prince was beyond their wildest dreams. "What about accessories, Mother?" Drizella asked, already envisioning herself dancing in the prince's arms. "Should we wear the pearl necklaces or the garnets?" "Both," Lady Tremain said decisively. "We'll layer them for a more dramatic effect. And we'll need dancing lessons immediately. I'll hire Master Beaumont from the village. He taught the mayor's daughters, and they're considered quite accomplished." As her stepfamily threw themselves into excited planning, Cinderella continued her morning chores, listening to their chatter with a mixture of amusement and longing. From her position kneeling by the fireplace, scrubbing away yesterday's ashes, she could hear every word of their ambitious preparations. "The masks will be the most important part," Lady Tremain continued, pacing the room as she planned. "They must be elaborate enough to suggest wealth and sophistication, but not so ornate that they overshadow your natural beauty. I'll commission the finest mask maker in the capital city." "Mother," Anastasia said suddenly, "what if other women wear similar colors? What if we don't stand out?" "That's why we'll spare no expense on the details," her mother replied. "The finest fabrics, the most expensive perfumes, the most elaborate hairstyles. You'll shine like jewels among mere stones." The talk turned to strategy, which conversation topics might impress a prince, how to curtsy gracefully in elaborate gowns, which dances were most likely to showcase their accomplished movements. Lady Tremain had read every etiquette manual she could acquire and was determined that her daughters would be flawless. "Remember," she instructed them as they practiced their curtsies, "a prince needs a wife who can represent the royal family with dignity. Show him your education, your refinement, your suitability to be queen. But don't appear too intelligent. Men prefer women who make them feel clever." Cinderella paused in her sweeping, struck by the contradiction in her stepmother's advice. How could someone be both refined and educated, yet not too intelligent? The logic seemed as twisted as the social conventions that created it. "What about you, Cinderella?" Anastasia asked suddenly, her tone carrying the false sweetness she used when she wanted to be particularly cruel. "Won't you be attending the royal ball?" The question caught Cinderella off guard. She looked up from her work to find all three women staring at her with expressions ranging from amusement to outright mockery. I hadn't thought about it," Cinderella replied honestly. The proclamation had reached every corner of the kingdom, but she had assumed it was meant for women of means, women who could afford appropriate attire for such an occasion. Drizella burst into laughter. "Mother, can you imagine? Cinderella at a royal ball, dancing with lords and ladies?" "The very idea is absurd," Lady Tremaine said dismissively. "The invitation may be open to all, but surely it's understood that all means all appropriate young women. Women who can dress the part, who understand proper etiquette, who won't embarrass themselves or others. Besides," Anastasia added with mock concern, "what would you wear? That brown dress you've had for 3 years? Perhaps you could fashion a mask from sackcloth." Their laughter filled the room, sharp and cutting as broken glass. Cinderella returned to her sweeping, keeping her face carefully neutral even as her cheeks burned with humiliation. She had learned long ago that reacting to their cruelty only encouraged more of it. "Cinderella will be far too busy helping us prepare to worry about attending herself," Lady Tremaine said with finality. "Someone must ensure our gowns are perfectly pressed, our shoes polished to a mirror shine, our hair arranged flawlessly. Such important work requires the full attention of our household." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparations that consumed the cottage entirely. Seamstresses came and went, carrying bolts of silk and satin. Dancing masters arrived for daily lessons. Hairdressers practiced elaborate styles. The modest home was transformed into a staging ground for what Lady Tremaine was convinced would be the most important night of their lives. Cinderella found herself busier than ever, tending to endless alterations, pressing delicate fabrics, polishing jewelry until it gleamed, and ensuring that every detail of her stepfamily's appearance would be perfect. She listened to their excited chatter about which conversation might the prince prefer. She watched them practice their most charming smiles in the mirror, and helped them rehearse graceful movements in their elaborate gowns. Through it all, she maintained her gentle demeanor and helpful nature, but privately, a small voice in her heart whispered questions she dared not speak aloud. Why shouldn't she attend? Why should her circumstances determine her worth? Why should her stepfamily's mockery define her possibilities? But as the night of the ball approached and she watched the final preparations, the last-minute adjustments to gowns, the careful application of cosmetics, the arrangement of jewels and masks, Cinderella pushed those questions aside. Some dreams, she told herself, were not meant for people like her. Some magic was reserved for those who already lived in its light. The evening of the ball, she stood in the cottage doorway and watched her stepfamily's carriage disappear into the darkness, carrying them toward a night of possibilities she could only imagine. Then she turned back to her quiet cottage, her waiting chores, and her small, persistent dreams that refused to be entirely extinguished. Chapter 5. The Fairy Godmother's Magic. The cottage felt hollow after the carriage wheels faded into the distance, leaving behind only the echo of excited voices and the lingering scent of expensive perfume. Cinderella stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the last glimmer of lantern light disappear around the bend, carrying her stepfamily toward their dreams while she remained anchored to her reality. She closed the door softly and surveyed the chaos left in their wake. Ribbons lay scattered across the floor like fallen flower petals. Hairpins glinted from forgotten corners, and powder dusted the table where last-minute cosmetic preparations had taken place. The detritus of their transformation mocked her with its abundance. They had discarded more finery in their haste than she had owned in years. Cinderella began to clean methodically, as she always did, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of restoring order. But tonight, each ribbon she collected felt heavier than usual. Each pin she gathered seemed to whisper of opportunities beyond her reach. By the time she finished, tears had begun to track silently down her cheeks. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in front of her step-family. The weight of accumulated loneliness pressed down upon her shoulders as she made her way to the garden, seeking solace in the only place that had ever truly felt like home. The moon hung full and bright overhead, bathing the flowers and vegetables in silver light that transformed her humble plot into something ethereal and beautiful. She knelt beside her mother's grave beneath the apple tree, her worn skirts spreading around her like the petals of a wilted flower. The simple stone markers seemed to glow in the moonlight, and the flowers she had placed there that morning still held their beauty despite the day's heat. "Oh, Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking with the grief she rarely allowed herself to feel. "I try so hard to be grateful for what I have, to find joy in small things, to believe that kindness will be rewarded somehow. But tonight I feel so very alone." The tears came freely now, months of suppressed sorrow pouring out like water from a broken dam. "I want to believe that somewhere in this world is someone who could love me as I am. But how will they ever find me here? How will they see past these clothes, this life, these circumstances that seem to define me in everyone else's eyes?" A gentle breeze stirred the apple tree's leaves, creating a soft whisper that seemed almost like a response. Cinderella looked up through her tears, and that's when she saw it. A soft, warm light beginning to gather among the branches, growing brighter with each passing moment. The light descended slowly, taking shape as it moved, until a figure materialized before her. Not the traditional elderly woman of fairy tales, but something far more beautiful and mysterious. The fairy godmother appeared as a shimmering presence that seemed to embody every loving memory Cinderella had of her mother, every moment of comfort she had ever known, every whispered prayer that had risen from her heart in times of despair. "Dear child," the fairy godmother said, her voice carrying the warmth of summer rain and the comfort of a mother's lullaby. "Your tears water the seeds of dreams that refuse to die, no matter how deeply they're buried." Cinderella stared in wonder, her grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this impossible vision. Who are you?" "I am love that transcends death, hope that survives despair, and magic that grows in hearts that remain kind despite cruelty," the fairy godmother replied. "Your mother's love, your own pure spirit, and the dreams you've never quite abandoned have called me here." The ethereal figure moved closer, her presence radiating a peace that Cinderella had not felt since childhood. "You believe you are trapped by your circumstances, but you have forgotten the most important truth. Your worth has nothing to do with your situation and everything to do with your spirit." "But how can anyone see that spirit when they look at me and see only a servant?" Cinderella asked, her voice small but earnest. The fairy godmother smiled with infinite tenderness. "Tonight, my dear one, you will attend the ball not as an escape from who you are, but as a celebration of exactly who you are. The magic I offer will not change your heart. It will simply allow your heart to be seen clearly." With gentle movements that seemed to sculpt light itself, the fairy godmother began to weave her magic. But this was not the dramatic transformation of traditional tales. Instead, it was a gradual revelation of the beauty that had always existed within Cinderella. Her worn brown dress began to shimmer and change, the fabric transforming into a gown of midnight blue that seemed to hold captured starlight in its folds. The color deepened her eyes and made her skin glow with inner radiance, but more importantly, the dress moved with her natural grace, enhancing rather than hiding her authentic self. "The gown reflects your depth and mystery," the fairy godmother explained. "But see how it does not change your posture, your movements, your essence, it simply allows these qualities to shine. Next came the mask, formed from what looked like crystallized moonlight and silver threads. It was beautiful yet simple, covering the upper half of Cinderella's face while leaving her expressive mouth and gentle smile visible. The mask would conceal her identity while highlighting the kindness that always lived in her expression. The mask will protect you from judgment based on your circumstances, the fairy godmother said, adjusting the delicate creation. Tonight, you will be seen only for your words, your actions, your heart. Finally, she created the glass slippers, not mere shoes, but symbols of the delicate yet unbreakable nature of true love. They formed from moonbeams and stardust, perfectly fitted to Cinderella's feet, comfortable yet elegant, strong yet beautiful. These slippers represent hope made manifest, the fairy godmother explained. They are as unique as your soul, and they will fit no one else because they are created specifically for your journey. As the transformation completed, Cinderella caught her reflection in the garden's small pond and gasped. She looked magnificent, but more importantly, she looked like herself. The best version of herself, the version that had always existed beneath the soot and worn fabric. Remember, the fairy godmother said, her form already beginning to fade, this magic will end at midnight, when the ordinary world reclaims its hold. But the confidence you find tonight, the knowledge of your own worth, the love you may discover, these will remain forever. What if I'm not enough? Cinderella asked, suddenly afraid of stepping into a world where she had never belonged. The fairy godmother's final words came like a blessing carried on the night wind. You have always been enough, dear one. Tonight you'll simply remember that truth. Go now, and let your authentic self shine so brightly that it illuminates the darkness in another's heart. As the magical presence dissolved into the moonlight, Cinderella stood alone in her garden, transformed yet unchanged, ready to step into a night that would alter the course of her life forever. The carriage that would carry her to the palace materialized from golden pumpkin vines drawn by horses that had once been field mice, and she knew that her greatest adventure was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Masquerade Ball begins. The royal palace blazed with light like a jewel set against the dark velvet of night. Every window glowed with the warm radiance of 1,000 candles, and the sound of music drifted across the grounds like an invitation carried on the evening breeze. Carriages lined the circular drive, depositing masked ladies in gowns of every color imaginable, each one stepping into the palace as if crossing the threshold into a dream. Inside the great ballroom, the transformation was complete. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls draped in silver and gold silk. Flowers from the royal gardens, roses, lilies, and jasmine filled massive urns throughout the space, their perfume mingling with the soft melodies of the kingdom's finest musicians. Tables laden with delicacies from across the realm lined the walls, while servants in masks of their own moved gracefully through the crowd, ensuring every guest felt welcomed and attended to. But it was the guests themselves who created the true magic of the evening. Rich merchants' daughters in elaborate silk masks stood beside farmers' daughters wearing simpler but no less beautiful disguises. The daughter of the kingdom's most powerful duke conversed animatedly with a baker's apprentice. Neither knowing the other's station, both engaged in genuine conversation about their shared love of literature. For the first time in the kingdom's history, every woman present was simply herself. No titles, no family names, no social expectations beyond courtesy and kindness. Prince Alexander stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the ballroom, his own disguise carefully crafted to ensure complete anonymity. His mask, wrought of intricate golden filigree, covered his face entirely, except for his eyes and mouth. His clothing, while fine, bore no royal insignia or distinctive markers that might give away his identity. To every person in that ballroom, he was simply another gentleman attending the masquerade, no more, no less. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander felt the intoxicating freedom of being unknown. As he watched the dancers swirl across the floor in a kaleidoscope of colors and motion, he realized that no one was watching him with calculating eyes, waiting for him to say something princely or profound. No one was performing for his benefit or positioning themselves for advantage. He moved through the crowd with growing confidence, engaging in conversations that flowed naturally rather than following the rigid protocols of court life. A young woman in an emerald mask spoke passionately about her work teaching children to read, never knowing she addressed royalty. Another, wearing silver and pearls, debated the merits of different farming techniques with an enthusiasm that would have shocked her noble parents. A third, masked in deep purple velvet, shared her dreams of opening a school for girls, speaking with conviction and intelligence that Alexander found refreshing. "The anonymity suits you," said a warm voice beside him. Alexander turned to find a gentleman roughly his own age, wearing a mask of midnight blue, adorned with small silver stars. "You seem more relaxed than most of the men here." "I suppose I am," Alexander replied honestly. "There's something liberating about being judged solely on one's conversation rather than one's circumstances." His companion chuckled. "Ah, a fellow philosopher. I'm Marcus, or at least, that's what I'm calling myself tonight. And you?" "Adrian," Alexander said, choosing a name at random. "It's a pleasure to meet someone else who appreciates the freedom this evening provides." As they talked, Alexander learned that Marcus was actually a court musician who had long observed the artificial nature of noble social gatherings. "I've played at countless balls and dinner parties," Marcus confided, "and I can tell you that tonight is different. Listen to the laughter. It's genuine. Watch the dancers. They're moving for joy, not display. This is what social gatherings should be." Alexander's spirits lifted with each conversation, each moment of authentic human connection. When Lady Cordelia passed by in an elaborate golden mask adorned with peacock feathers, she didn't give him a second glance. He was no longer the prince to be pursued, just another masked gentleman among many. The relief was overwhelming. "That lady in blue near the musicians," Marcus observed, nodding toward a figure Alexander hadn't yet noticed. "She's been standing there for several minutes, just watching everyone else dance. She looks almost wistful." Alexander followed his new friend's gaze and saw her, a young woman in a gown of midnight blue that seemed to capture and reflect the candlelight like still water under stars. Her mask was simpler than many others, wrought of what appeared to be crystallized moonlight, and she stood with the natural grace of someone comfortable in her own skin despite being in an unfamiliar environment. But it wasn't her appearance that captured Alexander's attention, it was her expression. Even through the mask, he could see genuine joy in her eyes as she watched other couples dance, a smile playing at her lips that suggested she found happiness in others' pleasure rather than envy or calculation. When a small child, the daughter of one of the palace staff, accidentally ran into her while chasing an escaped kitten, the masked woman in blue knelt gracefully to help the child up, speaking in gentle tones that carried across the ballroom despite the music. "She's beautiful," Marcus observed, "but more than that, she seems kind. Genuinely kind, not performing kindness." Alexander watched as the woman helped the child locate the kitten, which had hidden beneath one of the refreshment tables. Her movements were natural and unself-conscious, her concern for the child's well-being clearly authentic. When the little girl's mother arrived, flustered and apologetic, the masked woman simply smiled and said something that made both mother and child laugh before they disappeared back into the crowd. "I should ask her to dance," Alexander said, surprised by his own boldness. "You should," Marcus agreed, "but approach her gently. She seems like someone who values sincere conversation over flattery." Alexander made his way across the ballroom, his heart beating faster with each step. As he drew closer, he could see that the woman in blue was even more lovely than he had first realized, but it was a beauty that came from within, radiating through her posture and the warmth of her expression. When he was just a few steps away, she seemed to sense his approach and turned toward him. Their eyes met across the remaining distance, and Alexander felt something shift in his chest. A recognition that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with soul. "Good evening," he said, offering a respectful bow. "I was wondering if you might honor me with a dance." Her smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds, gentle and warm and completely genuine. "I would be delighted," she replied, and her voice carried the same warmth that lived in her eyes. As Alexander offered his arm and led her onto the dance floor, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was about to dance with someone who had chosen him simply because she wanted to, with no agenda beyond the pleasure of the moment. The music swelled around them as they took their positions, and Alexander felt as though his real life was finally beginning. Chapter 7. Love at First Conversation. As the orchestra began a gentle waltz, Alexander placed his hand at Cinderella's waist and felt a sense of rightness settle over him like a perfectly fitted garment. She moved with natural grace, following his lead effortlessly while maintaining her own distinct rhythm. Other couples swirled around them in a blur of silk and satin, but Alexander found his entire focus drawn to the woman in his arms. "You dance beautifully," he said as they glided across the polished marble floor. "Have you attended many balls?" Cinderella's laugh was like music itself, genuine and unguarded. "This is actually my first. I'm afraid I learned to dance in my garden, with only the flowers as my audience. I hope I don't embarrass you." "Impossible," Alexander replied, struck by her honesty. In his experience, ladies always claimed to be accomplished dancers, regardless of their actual skill. There's something wonderful about learning to dance for the pure joy of it, rather than for performance. "Exactly," she said, her eyes lighting up behind her mask. "Dance should be like laughter, something that bubbles up naturally when you're happy, not something you force for effect." As they moved together, their conversation flowed as smoothly as their steps. Alexander found himself sharing thoughts he had never voiced to another person. Ideas that had lived only in his private journal or in conversations with books. "I've always believed," he said, spinning her gently under his arm, "that the most beautiful things in life are often the simplest. A sunrise, a child's laughter, a conversation where both people forget to pretend to be anyone other than themselves." Cinderella's step faltered slightly, not from clumsiness but from surprise. That's exactly what I think too. Most people seem to believe that beauty requires complexity, that anything simple must be inferior. "Perhaps they've never tended a garden," Alexander suggested, remembering glimpses he'd caught of the palace gardens during his solitary walks. "There's profound beauty in watching something grow from a tiny seed into full flower, but it requires patience and daily care rather than grand gestures." "You understand gardens?" Cinderella asked, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "I spend every morning with my flowers and vegetables. There's something about having your hands in the earth, helping things grow, that makes everything else seem clearer somehow." Alexander felt his heart skip. He had expected to discuss literature or music, the typical subjects of ballroom conversation. Instead, he found himself talking with someone who understood the meditative peace he found in simple, honest work. "I've always thought," he said carefully, "that there's honor in any work done with care and love. Whether someone tends a garden or governs a kingdom, what matters is the intention behind the effort." "The intention and the effect on others," Cinderella agreed. "I'd rather spend my life making one small corner of the world more beautiful than achieve great fame for something that benefits no one." As the waltz ended and a livelier tune began, they moved to the edge of the dance floor. neither wanting to interrupt their conversation for the complexity of a more elaborate dance. Around them, other couples laughed and chattered, but Alexander felt as though he and his mysterious partner existed in their own private world. "What do you dream of?" he asked, the question emerging before he could consider whether it was too personal for a first meeting. Cinderella was quiet for a moment, and Alexander worried he had overstepped. But when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully considered truth. "I dream of a life where people see each other clearly," she said, "where kindness matters more than beauty, where wisdom is valued over wealth, where love grows from understanding rather than advantage." She paused, then added with shy vulnerability, "And I dream of finding someone who shares those values, someone who would love me, not for what I could give them, but for who I am, when no one else is watching." Alexander's breath caught. Her words echoed his own deepest longing so perfectly that for a moment he wondered if he was dreaming. That's exactly what I dream of too. I've watched so many people perform versions of themselves for social gain, and I've wondered if anyone simply wants to be known and loved for their authentic self. "It seems impossible sometimes," Cinderella admitted. "In my experience, people often want something from you. Your time, your service, your compliance. The idea that someone might simply want your company, your thoughts, your heart, it feels too wonderful to be real." "But it is real," Alexander said with sudden certainty. "It's happening right now, isn't it? I don't know your name or your family or your circumstances, and I find myself more interested in your thoughts than I've ever been in anyone's lineage or wealth." Cinderella looked at him with such open wonder that Alexander felt his heart expand in his chest. "Yes," she whispered, "I feel it too. I keep waiting for you to ask me about my connections or my dowry. But instead, you ask about gardens and dreams." They found themselves moving away from the dance floor entirely, drawn toward one of the tall windows that opened onto a balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The noise of the ballroom faded behind them as they stepped into the moonlit night, where the scent of roses and jasmine created an atmosphere of intimacy and magic. "I have a confession," Alexander said, leaning against the stone balustrade. "I was dreading tonight. I've attended so many social gatherings where every conversation felt like a performance, where I left feeling more lonely than when I arrived." "And now?" Cinderella asked, moving to stand beside him, close enough that he could see how the moonlight caught in her dark hair. "Now I feel like I've been holding my breath for years, and I can finally exhale," he replied. "You make me feel like myself, not the version of myself I think others want to see, but who I actually am." Cinderella turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw the same revelation that was dawning in his own heart. "I feel the same way. For so long, I've hidden parts of myself because they didn't seem acceptable or valuable to others. But with you, I find myself speaking truths I've barely admitted to myself." The music drifted out from the ballroom, softer now and sweeter, as if the very night was conspiring to create the perfect moment for two hearts to recognize each other. Alexander reached out tentatively and took Cinderella's gloved hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his own. "I know this sounds impossible after only one evening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I feel as though I've been searching for you my entire life without knowing what I was looking for." Cinderella's other hand came up to rest gently against his cheek, and Alexander leaned into the touch like a flower turning toward sunlight. "It doesn't sound impossible," she said softly. "It sounds like the most natural thing in the world." In that moment, surrounded by moonlight and the perfume of night-blooming flowers, Alexander knew with absolute certainty that he was looking into the eyes of the woman he wanted to spend his life loving. And in Cinderella's gentle smile, he saw the same recognition reflected back at him, as clear and true as starlight. Chapter 8. The Garden Confession and Midnight Flight. The palace gardens stretched before them like a tapestry woven from moonlight and shadow, with gravel paths winding between beds of roses that released their perfume into the cool night air. Alexander led Cinderella down the main walkway, past fountains that sang softly in the darkness, and arbors heavy with climbing jasmine. Neither spoke as they walked, both seeming to understand that they had crossed some invisible threshold, where words were less important than simply being together. They found themselves in a secluded alcove surrounded by white roses that glowed like captured stars in the moonlight. A small marble bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree, and the distant sound of music from the ballroom seemed to belong to another world entirely. Here, in this private sanctuary, the pretenses of the masquerade felt almost sacred. They had found each other not despite their disguises, but because of the freedom those disguises provided. "I've never felt anything like this," Alexander said quietly, turning to face Cinderella in the dappled moonlight. "This connection, this certainty that I've found someone who understands not just my words, but the thoughts behind them." Cinderella's eyes shimmered behind her mask, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had never expected to experience such profound recognition. "I feel as though I've been living my life in black and white, and suddenly everything is in color. Is it possible to know someone so completely after just one evening?" "I think," Alexander said, reaching up to gently touch the edge of her mask, "that we've known each other much longer than one evening. Perhaps our souls recognized each other the moment we met." The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming, and Alexander felt a sudden desperate need to be completely honest with her. This woman had accepted him without knowing his title, had fallen in love with his mind and heart rather than his crown. If their connection was to be real, and he knew with every fiber of his being that it was the most real thing he had ever experienced, then it had to be built on truth. "I need to tell you something," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the ties of his mask. "I need you to know who I really am." "Wait," Cinderella said, placing her hand gently over his. "Are you certain? Once we remove our masks, we can't go back to this perfect moment, where we're just two people who found each other in a crowded room." Alexander's heart clenched at her words, understanding exactly what she meant. But his love for her demanded honesty, even if that honesty might change everything between them. "I'm certain," he said softly, "because I love you, and love without truth isn't really love at all." With careful movements, Alexander untied his golden mask and let it fall away, revealing his unremarkable face in the moonlight. He watched Cinderella's expression carefully, waiting for the moment when recognition would dawn, when she would realize she had been conversing with royalty, when everything would change. But Cinderella's gaze never wavered. She looked into his ordinary brown eyes, studied his crooked nose and thin hair, and her smile only grew warmer and more radiant. "You're the prince," she said simply, and Alexander's heart stopped. You knew?" "I suspected," she admitted, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "But not because of how you look, because of how you think, how you speak about wanting to serve your people, how you understand the loneliness of being wanted for everything except who you truly are." Alexander stared at her in wonder. "And it doesn't matter to you that I'm not handsome, that I am not the prince of fairy tales?" Cinderella's laugh was soft and full of love. "Oh, my dear man, you are so much more beautiful than any fairy tale prince because your beauty comes from your heart, your kindness, your intelligence, your genuine desire to make the world better. These are what make you handsome to me." She traced the line of his jaw with gentle fingers, her touch reverent and sure. "I have spent my life surrounded by people who value only surface beauty, only external worth. But you see clearly. You think deeply. You love genuinely. How could I not fall in love with such a soul? Alexander felt tears prick his eyes at her words. No one had ever seen him so clearly, accepted him so completely, loved him so unconditionally. "I love you," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of every lonely night, every false smile he had endured, every dream he had cherished of finding exactly this kind of love. "And I love you," Cinderella replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "Not Prince Alexander, not the crown or the title or the wealth. I love the man who asks about gardens and dreams of simple beauty." They moved closer together on the marble bench, and Alexander felt as though his heart might burst from the fullness of joy and love and perfect understanding. He was about to ask her name, to beg her to tell him everything about herself, when the distant sound of bells began to chime across the palace grounds. Midnight. Cinderella's face went pale as the first chime echoed through the garden. "No," she whispered, pulling back from his embrace. "It can't be midnight already." "What's wrong?" Alexander asked, alarmed by the sudden panic in her voice. "What happens at midnight?" But Cinderella was already standing, her hands pressed to her mask, as if to make sure it was still in place. "I have to go," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "I have to leave right now." "Wait," Alexander said, rising quickly to catch her hand. "Please, tell me your name. Tell me how to find you." The bells continued their relentless chiming, and with each stroke, Cinderella seemed to grow more desperate. "I can't," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. When the magic ends, you'll see me as I really am, and everything will be different." "Nothing could change how I feel about you," Alexander protested. But Cinderella was already pulling away, backing toward the path that led to the palace. "You say that now," she said, her voice breaking, "but I'm not who you think I am. I'm not a lady of the court or a merchant's daughter. I'm no one special, no one worthy of a prince's love." "You're everything to me," Alexander called after her as she began to run back toward the palace. "Your heart is what makes you worthy, not your circumstances." But Cinderella was already disappearing into the shadows of the garden path, her midnight blue gown flowing behind her like water under moonlight. Alexander gave chase, his heart pounding with fear at the thought of losing her forever. He followed her through the palace corridors, past startled guests and servants, up the grand staircase and through the main entrance. But she was faster than he was, desperation lending speed to her flight, and by the time he reached the palace steps, she was already climbing into a magnificent carriage that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "Please," he shouted as the carriage began to move, "at least tell me your name." But the only answer was the sound of wheels on cobblestones and the final stroke of midnight echoing across the kingdom. As the 12th chime faded into silence, Alexander saw something glinting on the palace steps, a single glass slipper, delicate as spun moonlight, left behind in her desperate flight. He picked up the slipper with trembling hands, cradling it against his chest as the carriage disappeared into the darkness beyond the palace gates. The glass was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own inner light, as if it contained some essence of the woman he loved. Standing alone on the palace steps, holding the only tangible proof that the most perfect evening of his life had been real, Alexander made a vow to the stars and the night wind. He would find her again, no matter what it took, no matter how long it required. Love like theirs was too precious to lose to fear or misunderstanding. The masquerade ball continued inside, but for Alexander, the real world had contracted to the size of a glass slipper and the memory of a woman who had loved him exactly as he was. Chapter 9. The Search and Self-Doubt. The morning after the masquerade ball dawned gray and somber, as if the very sky mourned the loss of magic. Prince Alexander stood in his chambers, still holding the glass slipper that had become his most precious possession, watching the sunrise paint the palace walls in shades of gold that reminded him painfully of the happiness he had found and lost in a single night. He had not slept. Instead, he had spent the hours until dawn walking the palace gardens, retracing the steps he had taken with his mysterious love, trying to make sense of her desperate flight. Her words echoed in his mind. "When the magic ends, you'll see me as I really am, and everything will be different." What magic? What could possibly make him love her less than he did in that perfect moment when she had accepted his unremarkable face with such tender reverence? By mid-morning, Alexander had made his decision. Despite the protests of his advisors, who urged him to consider the political implications of such an unprecedented announcement, he called for the royal herald and dictated a proclamation that would be read in every corner of the kingdom. "Let it be known," the herald proclaimed from the palace steps to a growing crowd of curious citizens, "that His Royal Highness Prince Alexander has found his true love at the royal masquerade ball. The woman who captured his heart departed before he could learn her name, leaving behind only a glass slipper as proof of their encounter." The crowd murmured with excitement and speculation as the herald continued, "The prince hereby declares his intention to marry the woman who wore this slipper, and he calls upon her to present herself at the palace so that their love story might reach its proper conclusion. Furthermore, to ensure that no deception occurs, every woman who claims to be his beloved must prove her identity by fitting the glass slipper perfectly." Word of the prince's announcement spread through the kingdom like wildfire. In manor houses and cottages, in shops and farmhouses, women began examining their feet with new interest while their families calculated the advantages of a real marriage. At Lady Tremaine's cottage, the news arrived via an excited neighbor who could barely contain her glee at sharing such momentous gossip. Drizella and Anastasia, still exhausted from their late night at the ball, immediately came alive with renewed ambition. "It has to be one of us," Drizella declared with absolute certainty. "We were the most beautiful women at the ball. Surely the prince noticed us." "I'm certain it was me," Anastasia countered, already imagining herself in a queen's crown. "He definitely looked in my direction when I was dancing with Lord Pemberton." Lady Tremaine's mind raced with possibilities. Neither of her daughters had mentioned any particular success with potential suitors at the ball, but perhaps they had been modest about their conquests. After all, one of them could have met the prince without knowing his identity. That was the entire point of the masquerade. "We must prepare immediately," she commanded. "When the prince arrives with the glass slipper, you must both be ready to prove your claims." From her position by the fireplace, where she was quietly mending a torn petticoat, Cinderella listened to their excited chatter with a heart that felt as heavy as stone. She knew the glass slipper would fit her perfectly. She could still feel the warmth of the magical shoes that had carried her through the most wonderful night of her life. But she also knew the truth that her stepfamily could never understand. She was the woman the prince sought, and she would never have the courage to claim him. In the 3 days since the ball, Cinderella had replayed every moment of that magical evening, examining each word, each touch, each look that had passed between them. She had convinced herself that their connection, however real it had felt in the moment, could never survive the harsh light of day and the reality of their different circumstances. Yes, Alexander had told her that her heart made her worthy, but he had said those words to a woman in an enchanted gown, with a face made beautiful by fairy magic. He had fallen in love with a mysterious lady at a royal ball, not with a servant girl who scrubbed floors and tended gardens. The magic that had transformed her appearance for one night had also transformed her into someone worthy of a prince's love. When the magic ended, so had her worthiness. "Cinderella!" Lady Tremaine's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Stop your wool gathering and help your sisters prepare. Everything must be perfect. For the next week, the cottage became a flurry of activity as Drizella and Anastasia prepared for their audiences with royalty. They practiced walking gracefully in anticipation of trying on the slipper, rehearsed charming speeches about their evening at the ball, and argued constantly about which of them the prince had actually fallen in love with. Meanwhile, news arrived daily of other women throughout the kingdom who had presented themselves at the palace, claiming to be the prince's mysterious love. The baker's daughter insisted she had shared a meaningful dance with a masked gentleman. The miller's youngest girl swore she had engaged in deep conversation about literature with someone who must have been the prince. Lady Catherine's niece arrived from the capital city, certain that her sophisticated conversation had won royal affections. One by one, they tried on the glass slipper. One by one, they failed. The slipper was indeed magical. It would fit no foot but the one for which it had been created. Some women found it too small, others too large. A few could force their feet partway into the delicate shoe, but the magical glass would not accommodate anyone but its true owner. With each failed attempt, Prince Alexander grew more despondent. He had been so certain that his proclamation would bring his beloved back to him, so confident that love would overcome whatever fears had driven her away. But as days turned into weeks without success, he began to fear that she had left the kingdom entirely. Or worse, that she had decided their connection had been nothing more than the romantic fantasy of a single evening. His parents watched their son's growing despair with helpless concern. The vibrant hope that had transformed Alexander after the masquerade ball was slowly dimming, replaced by a resigned sadness that broke their hearts. They had given him one perfect night of authentic connection, but it seemed that one night would have to sustain him for the rest of his life. Perhaps, Queen Isabella suggested gently during one of their evening meals, you should consider that she may have had reasons for leaving that had nothing to do with her feelings for you. What reason could be strong enough to overcome love? Alexander asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. If she felt even a fraction of what I felt that night, how could anything keep her away? The king and queen exchanged worried glances. They had never seen their son so dejected, not even during the worst days of his loneliness before the ball. At least then he had hope. Now he seemed to be losing even that. In her small cottage across the kingdom, Cinderella went about her daily chores with mechanical precision, her body present, but her heart locked away in the memory of a moonlit garden where a prince had loved her for exactly who she was. She watched her stepfamily's increasingly frantic preparations for their own audience with the prince, knowing all the while that she held the key to his happiness in her very being. But knowledge and courage were two different things entirely. Each day that passed made it easier to convince herself that their love had been an illusion, a product of magic and moonlight that could never survive in the ordinary world. Each night, she stood in her garden and looked toward the palace, wondering if Alexander was looking at the same stars and feeling the same impossible longing that kept her awake until dawn. The glass slipper continued its journey, carried by a prince who refused to give up hope, while the woman it belonged to convinced herself that some dreams were too beautiful to survive the light of day. Chapter 10. Recognition, Truth, and Happily Ever After. 3 weeks had passed since the royal proclamation, and Prince Alexander had grown gaunt from sleepless nights and barely touched meals. Despite the protests of his advisors and the concerns of his parents, he refused to abandon his search. The glass slipper had become both his greatest treasure and his deepest torment, proof that the most perfect love of his life had been real, yet seemingly impossible to reclaim. Your Highness, his personal secretary ventured carefully during one particularly difficult morning, perhaps it's time to consider that the lady may have moved beyond the kingdom's borders. Alexander looked up from the correspondence he had been staring at without reading, his eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. "Then I'll search beyond the kingdom's borders," he said quietly. "I'll search the entire world if necessary." That afternoon, against all advice and protocol, Alexander dismissed his royal entourage and set out alone on horseback, carrying only the glass slipper and a heavy heart. He could no longer bear the formal presentations in the palace throne room, the parade of hopeful women and calculating families. His beloved had not come to him, so he would go to her. He rode through villages and countryside, stopping at every cottage and farmhouse, speaking with every young woman he encountered. But none possessed the voice that had spoken to him about gardens and dreams. None had the gentle laugh that had made his heart soar. None looked at him with eyes that saw his soul rather than his crown. As the sun began to set on his third day of solitary searching, Alexander found himself in a small village on the outskirts of his kingdom, a place he had never visited during his royal duties. The cottages here were modest but well-tended, with small gardens that spoke of care and pride despite limited means. He was preparing to seek lodging for the night when he heard it. A voice carried on the evening breeze, soft and sweet, as it had been in his dreams every night since the ball. Someone was singing in one of the cottage gardens, a simple melody about flowers blooming in spring, but it was the voice that made Alexander's heart stop beating. He followed the sound like a man in a trance, leading his horse along a narrow path, until he came to a small cottage with a garden that took his breath away. Despite the humble setting, the plot was arranged with an artist's eye for beauty vegetables and flowers intermingled in perfect harmony, creating a living tapestry that spoke of deep love and patient care. And there, kneeling among the late-season flowers with her back to him, was a young woman in a simple brown dress, her dark hair pinned back as she tended to the plants with gentle, practiced hands. She was humming softly to herself, completely absorbed in her work, and Alexander knew with absolute certainty that he had found her. "Excuse me," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. Cinderella's hands stilled on the flower stems, her entire body tensing as if she recognized his voice, but couldn't believe her ears. Slowly, she turned around, and Alexander saw her face clearly for the first time without mask or magical enhancement, and found her even more beautiful than his memory had painted her. Her simple clothing couldn't hide her natural grace. Her lack of cosmetics only emphasized the genuine warmth in her dark eyes, and the slight smudge of earth on her cheek made her seem so real, so wonderfully human after weeks of encountering women who presented themselves like porcelain dolls. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're here." "I've been searching for you," Alexander said, dismounting from his horse but staying where he was, afraid that sudden movement might cause her to flee again. "Every day since the ball, I've been looking for the woman who made me feel like myself for the first time in my life." Cinderella's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head slowly. "You shouldn't have come here. You don't understand. I'm not who you think I am." "You're exactly who I think you are," Alexander replied gently. "You're the woman who spoke about gardens and simple beauty, who dreamed of a world where kindness matters more than appearances, who looked into my unremarkable face and saw something worth loving." "But look at me now," Cinderella said, spreading her arms to indicate her humble surroundings and simple dress. "No gown, no magic, no mystery. Just a servant girl who scrubs floors and tends vegetables. How can this be the woman a prince fell in love with?" Alexander smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd worn since the night she'd run from him. "Because you're still humming the same gentle melody you hummed when you helped that child at the ball. Because your hands are dirty from tending growing things, just like you told me they would be. because you're still worried about others' happiness before your own, even mine." He reached into his traveling pack and withdrew the glass slipper, which seemed to capture and reflect the last rays of sunlight like captured starfire. "And because this belongs to you." Cinderella stared at the slipper, her breath catching. "You want me to try it on?" "I want you to trust me," Alexander said, moving closer slowly. "Trust that what we felt that night was real, that it was based on who you truly are, not on magic or pretense." With trembling hands, Cinderella sat on the garden bench her father had built so many years ago. Alexander knelt before her in the soft earth, heedless of his fine clothes, and gently took her foot in his hands. The glass slipper slid on as if it had been made for her, which, in every way that mattered, it had been. The moment the slipper was in place, it seemed to glow with inner light. But more importantly, Alexander looked up into Cinderella's face and saw the same radiant joy that had captivated him at the ball. "It's you," he said simply. "It's really you." "I was so afraid," Cinderella whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I thought once you saw me without the magic, without the beautiful gown." "The magic was never in the gown," Alexander said, rising to sit beside her on the bench and taking her hands in his. "The magic was in you, your kindness, your wisdom, your gentle heart. That's what I fell in love with, and that's what I see right now." Cinderella looked into his eyes and saw the same unconditional love and acceptance she remembered from the moonlit garden. "And I love you, not the prince, not the crown, but the man who values gardens and dreams and believes that hearts matter more than appearances." Alexander cupped her face in his hands, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his embrace. "Marry me," he said, "not because I'm a prince and you fit the slipper, but because I cannot imagine living my life without your laughter, your wisdom, your beautiful soul beside me." "Yes," Cinderella whispered, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home. Their wedding took place in the palace gardens, surrounded by flowers that Cinderella had helped to plan and plant. It was a simple ceremony by royal standards, attended by people from every walk of life. Nobles and farmers, merchants and servants, all united in celebrating a love that had proven hearts matter more than circumstances. Cinderella wore a gown of her own choosing, beautiful but not magical, because she had learned that her worth came from within. Alexander stood beside her without his crown, because in her eyes he had always been enough exactly as he was. As king and queen, they ruled with wisdom and compassion, creating a kingdom where people were valued for their character rather than their birth. Cinderella's stepfamily, faced with the reality of her true nature and royal status, eventually learned to appreciate the virtues they had once scorned. But more than their reign, it was their love story that became legend, not because of magic or transformation, but because it proved that true love recognizes true worth, that authentic connection transcends all barriers, and that sometimes the most ordinary-seeming people possess the most extraordinary hearts. In the palace gardens that Cinderella tended with her own hands, visitors could often find the king and queen in the evening hours, walking hand in hand among the flowers, still talking and laughing together like the two souls who had found each other in a crowded ballroom and chosen to see past masks to the beautiful truth beneath. And they lived, not in the perfection of fairy tales, but in the deeper magic of a love built on understanding, acceptance, and the radical belief that every heart has value when it chooses kindness over cruelty, authenticity over pretense, and love over fear.